Okay, let's get started, shall we? Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here at USIP on this cold and gray day. Thank you all for making the trek to be here. Over in Karachi, on the other hand, where much of Pakistan's media is based, it is a positively balmy 77 degrees. And it was in Karachi just 1 week ago that yet another attack was made on journalists. 3 employees of the Express Media Group were gunned down and another injured. So Pakistan remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, which is just one of the many pressures that shape Pakistan media reporting of conflict and politics. I'm Sheldon Himmelfarb, and I manage our Peace Tech initiative here at USIP, where we work at this nexus of media, technology, and data in an effort to tackle the challenges of conflict management and peace building. And we are really honored to have a wonderful panel here who are going to take you inside many of the other pressures on Pakistan media. We're all familiar with that critique of sensationalism in the Pakistan media and the concerns that the race for ratings is one of the things fanning the flames of intolerance. But in each of the presentations today, I think we're going to get well beyond that simple or simplistic critique. And we are really happy to have our friends from BBC Media Action with us, and we're looking forward to diving into their latest insights into Pakistan. Their report focuses on regional vernacular media and on social media, which adds depth and complexity and should prompt new thinking about the media's potential for fostering inclusive dialogue and participation of diverse voices in Pakistan's political debates. And both of the authors, Huma Yusuf, who's here with us today, and Emma Shoemaker, they are all both friends of USIP who have worked with USIP on research papers and media assessment methodologies. So welcome back to USIP, Huma. Here at USIP, we are coming to the end of a detailed research project on Pakistan media reporting of violence, using a combination of audience research, media interviews, and extensive content analysis. We are ground truthing some of those claims that I referred to earlier that are made about the Pakistan media. And USIP is deeply committed to the idea that change must originate with local media organizations and citizens. So importantly, we're about to go to the Pakistan media organizations themselves with our research, to talk about this research and put them in the driver's seat about what should be done with this. But it's also intended to assist media policy and program design, and we need to be thinking about how our priorities and our methods should change to assist Pakistan media organizations to help them achieve their goals. And Michael Dwyer, who's on the panel here, has been leading this important work at USIP. It's a busy and exciting time for us here in what we call our Peace Tech initiative. Earlier today, some of you were here. I noticed some of you were here this morning. We launched our media assessment of the media in Myanmar. And we've also this week published the third of our Logs and Bullets research on the role of social media in the Syrian conflict. So all of those reports are out there on the desk outside, and I would really urge you to take a look at them if you're interested in this nexus between media and conflict. I'm going to hand over the podium in a minute to Moe to say a few words, but I should also say it's a great pleasure to welcome Pam Constable back to USIP to moderate this discussion. Glad to see you here, Pam. To respond to the presentations and to generally challenge all of you to be a very active audience. Her 2 books on Pakistan are must-reads, so you can be sure that our panelists know that they're not going to be getting away with any loose talk today with Pam as our moderator. Speaking of loose talk, last thing, housekeeping, please set your phones on stun mode, or we'll have to ask our friends in the NSA to do it for you. It's just a joke. So, welcome everyone. I'm really pleased that you're here. Let me turn it over to Moeed to say some introductory words as well.
Thanks. Welcome everyone to USIP and to this event. My job is to do what I hear people do at these events, and then I say, why did this person have to do this? You already know it. So I'm here to welcome you and thank you for being here. Sheldon has said much of what I wanted to. I am Moeed Yusuf. I head the South Asia program here at USIP. I just want to quickly run you through what we do and then hand it over to Pam to do what we're really here for. The South Asia program traditionally has been focused mostly on Pakistan. That's been our biggest program in the South Asia Center, and Afghanistan in the sort of Afghanistan and Central Asia part of our South and Central Asia division. In Pakistan, we do both research and analysis and also programmatic work with civil society through our own expertise in USIP and our grant-making program, which works with local partners and civil society on the ground to effect two things. One, to inform better policy making through our research and analysis and improve the credibility of the Pakistani state. And second, specifically to work on increasing tolerance of diversity in Pakistan. And these are the two areas that we see USIP have a niche in, but also the two drivers of conflict, which I think are often not understood well in Pakistan. So that's where most of our work is focused. Media is an essential component of that, and Sheldon and his team do a fantastic job. I wouldn't steal Michael's thunder, who will tell you about the research work that we've done over the past year. But in addition to research, we also work in the messaging space through the media, through social and electronic and print media, to try and reduce the space for violence, which is often generated through these messages, and media is a part of that. To increase the social taboo on violence and to increase the incentives for peaceful behavior. And so research and this messaging come together to make our media work potent in Pakistan. Finally, just quickly, Sheldon mentioned Huma has published reports for us in the past. Her report on Karachi, the conflict dynamics in Karachi, you'll find outside, and it's definitely a must-read given what we hear about Karachi every day. It really gets into the nuts and bolts of what is going on there. Her report is part of our broader project on conflict mapping of Pakistan. And what we do is we go to the sub-national level, whether it's provincial, ethnic, communal, geographic, etc., and look at various dynamics of conflict across themes, across geography in Pakistan. And there, media, again, fits in crucially, and the topic that Huma is going to talk about today, because we are now moving from an understanding of Pakistan at the national level, which we do all the time, looking at English media, English language press and media, to regional and sub-regional outlets of print and electronic media, which really, I think, influence Pakistan much more than the national level that we consume here in Washington and others. So I look forward to hearing this, and Pam, it's over to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me, more or less? It's a small room, so we should be okay. Delighted to have you all here, and especially happy to see Huma, who I got to know when we were both fellows at the Wilson Center. I was working on my most recent Pakistan book, and she was working on some of her projects, so we became good friends, and it's glad to see her here and to read this report, which is really excellent. Happy to meet Michael after some phone conversations, meet you in person. I'm just going to make a couple of brief points before turning it over to Huma and her report, and then hopefully afterwards we'll have a lively discussion. Feel free to make comments, critiques, as well as questions. We really would like to have a provocative and thoughtful exchange. When I was coming here today, I was thinking that the first time I worked in Pakistan, which was in 1998, there was basically almost no media at all. It basically consisted of Pakistan state television, which basically consisted of cricket matches and propaganda videos about atrocities in Kashmir. That's pretty much all you could see. So too little. Now, of course, we've gone the other extreme. Too much. Too many voices, too many competing channels. It's really become a Tower of Babel in some ways. But I think all of us would agree that's much better than the alternative. Yet, we also know that Pakistani media is very much a work in progress. It's both fledgling and deeply flawed, as Huma has said and pointed out in the report. It does much that is extremely positive for the society, opening up access to new voices in many languages. I noticed that I think in rural areas there's even higher coverage of social media and cell phones than there is even in urban areas. You can now reach village elders on a cell phone. People are now tweeting from the most remote parts of Pakistan. So there's now this proliferation of communication that was never there before in a very short time, really a decade, and it's really been for the past half decade that this really has begun to snowball with all the good and all the bad. Part of the problem is that, as with any newly developing media, especially in a country as complicated as Pakistan, where you have very strong military intelligence institutions and where you have a violent conflict going on, there's always a question of how far to go. How far can you go in a country like Pakistan? What can you criticize? What can't you criticize? Whom do you have to fear? Whom do you have to worry offending? And if we just take the most obvious one to begin with, the Army and its related agencies, it's very easy to criticize, but only up to a point. And I'll just use a wonderful quote here in the latest melodrama about Musharraf and would he or wouldn't he be going on trial. There was lots of wonderful commentary about, would the military establishment allow him to go on trial? And there was this wonderful quote that I used in a story from this wonderful lawyer and columnist Babar Sattar, who said that basically the effort to prevent him from going on trial was as follows. This is about bravado, hubris, and impunity, touted as professional honor and esprit de corps. The safe exit option for Musharraf is not meant to guard against a general being punished, but to preempt the ghastly precedent and ignominy of a general being tried in civilian court. It's a lovely quote, very glib, very articulate, but it's only a comment. It's not about facts. When you start getting into facts, when you start delving into things that the military holds sacred, its perquisites, its property, its power, you can get in very serious trouble, as Salim Shahzad did, got killed for investigating abuses within the Navy. So there's lots of room for chit-chat, and there's lots of room for sarcasm and lots of room for opinion. But there's still a very, very dangerous ground when you try to get at the facts. So that's one problem with the national security state and a free media as a combination. The other problem is something that I would call sort of a combination of the lack of professionalism and this incredibly strong tendency to criticize and be ad hominem. Both the print media and television especially have become shouting matches in which people say almost anything. And so it debases the entire discourse. When you go on these evening talk shows, which are incredibly competitive, there's many, many of them, as we said before, competing for ratings. So the prize goes to the shrillest voice, not to the most articulate or thoughtful commentator. And people do say the most outrageous things, which is fine if you're in a country of people that are highly educated and informed and have access to multiple sources of information. When you're dealing with a relatively new audience in a country with a fairly high illiteracy rate, and where people have really been brought up to defer to those in authority rather than to express their own opinions, this idea of saying whatever comes into your head can have a very negative influence. And people get very confused, and people get very strongly conflicting signals from the opinion makers among them. And therefore, I think that there has been a lack of responsibility on the part of people whose opinions do carry weight. I'm afraid too often they're not expressing ideas that are, I guess the word really is responsible enough, and are really just sort of venting. And the other thing is that very often you find that public media, television especially, and now we have social media, which is a slightly different topic, is really used to present what I'm trying to say here. Points of view that are more than irresponsible. There is a great deal of appeasement of religious groups and very conservative religious movements. I think it's partly out of fear, and I think it's partly out of affinity, which is something that I wrote about in my recent book, which I think is a very dangerous combination of the growth of ultranationalism, anti-Westernism, sectarianism, and the appeal of fundamentalism, not just the danger of suicide bombing, but the appeal of fundamentalist thought and the appeal of this notion of a moral crusade against the modern, westernized, vulgar society that many religious groups warn against. And you know, they have, I mean, we've all spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and we know that it's very appealing to many Pakistanis when they hear, oh, the West is out to destroy us and out to destroy Islam, and 9/11 was a fraud, and it was. You still hear this today in Pakistan. It's very easy for Pakistanis to connect the dots, whether we think they're true dots or not. When you have radical mullahs standing up on the radio, in pulpits, on television, in social media, saying the most outrageous things, including 9/11 was a plot by the Mossad and the CIA. This kind of thing that gets repeated over and over again. You know, drone campaigns, you know, we're our own worst enemy, frankly, in the drone campaign, because we fulfill every Pakistani's worst fear. So there are reasons that Pakistanis, in many cases, are drawn to these kinds of arguments. So my point is that in a country with so much conflict, so much confusion, so many conflicting messages, and so much danger, it's really incumbent on professionals in the media to be thoughtful, to be responsible, and to be as accurate as possible. And for many reasons, which we will be getting into later on, this is not always what's happening. So I'm just going to stop there with a few thoughts. And you know, Huma, please feel free to talk as long as you want, and then we'll have a good discussion after that.
Okay, thanks, Pam. Thank you, everyone, for coming. The way that Pam has spoken about Pakistan's media, the challenges of a non-professional industry facing a lot of pressures, you know, promoting narratives that are problematic in other ways, is how we often talk about the media when you're outside Pakistan. And in the English language press, for example, within Pakistan, you'll see a lot of frothing at the mouth about sort of the irresponsible political talk shows and the sort of messages that they're putting out and the muddled narratives that they're promoting. But within Pakistan, there's also a separate conversation happening about the media in Pakistan. And it is a more positive story. And it looks at the fact that there is this slow shift towards democracy becoming just a little bit more entrenched in Pakistan. So you'll see this, there's this narrative of this democratic transition, which comes starting largely with the elections last year, which were historic in many ways, and then going on to the fact that at the same time, the Pakistan Army has been sort of reiterating the fact that it would like to withdraw from the political space, that it won't be interfering in politics. Local government elections are underway in Pakistan. We've already had them in Balochistan. They're scheduled to happen in the other provinces in coming months. And for the first time in Pakistani history, these elections, the local government elections are taking place on a party-wise basis under a democratic elected government. So that's, you know, progress, I'd say. And when this conversation about Pakistan's democratic transition happens, you also get people pointing to the fact that the judiciary is more independent than it's ever been before, and that might bring with it sort of other pitfalls in terms of it being more activist in the way that it engages with Pakistan's political dynamics. But then the other thing that's always cited is this free media. And there really is a sense that there is something really inherently democratizing about the cacophony that the media is offering. And so one of the things we set out to do with this BBC report was to start really grilling this question, like what role is the Pakistani media playing in the democratic transition? And to clarify here, what I mean by Pakistani media, I'll be using that term, but what I'm referring to is privately owned, commercial, television media for the most part, but also radio stations, the internet, and the wide access to mobile phones. And I'll get into some statistics in a minute. And one of the things that we realized was that there's all this talk, this top-level talk about the media in Pakistan, but we don't really know how it's being received on the other end. So the BBC Media Action report tried to get the audience perspective on the transition and was able for the first time to do focus group research in rural and urban areas to sort of talk more on this point. And the narrative that we heard from the people is different than the narrative you hear in contexts like this. So when we now talk about Pakistani media and its role in Pakistan's democratic transition, there is this sense of several new actors and state institutions, the army, judiciary, the civilian government, and then the media as an actor as well, involved in this new institutional tussle and sort of renegotiating of Pakistan's historic political dynamic or bargain, as it were. And we talk in this sort of top-level way, but what you hear from the ground up is actually mostly positive news. There's this sense that the media has been a huge player in terms of helping for the first time in an unprecedented way, allowing people to engage in the conversation. And I'll just talk a little bit about some of what we heard. There is this sense that there is a new ability for people to articulate their public demand and to be heard in the corridors of power. There was this sense in all the focus group discussions that we got transcripts for, that the media is playing a positive role. People feel more empowered because they feel that if the media hears their problems, then someone in power who can do something about their problems is hearing about them as well. People were especially happy about the fact that there has been this proliferation of regional language media. So just to set the stage a little bit, Pakistan has 90 privately owned television channels, and this is following a period of media liberalization in 2002. And before that, as Pam has already mentioned, there was, in the broadcast sector, there was only state-owned radio and TV. We also have 115 FM radio stations around the country. Mobile phone penetration is at 70%, probably a little bit higher. And internet access is available to between 20 and 30 million people. We don't have exact stats yet. Most of the media that we talk about is the Urdu language national media channels that broadcast across the country. But the ones that got the highest sort of support and who generated the most amount of excitement amongst the focus group participants were the regional language channels. And these are channels that broadcast in regional languages such as Sindhi, Balochi, Punjabi, Saraiki, and are much more concerned with local level issues. So they are looking at crop prices in rural parts of the country. They're looking at road construction projects, local transport issues, market unions, things like that, really local level issues. And they are speaking in their own languages to each other. Some of the examples that we've seen are, for example, Sindhi language television channels, which are amongst the most feisty and professional and have some of the highest ratings in the country. And in addition to doing sort of local programming, they're also advocating for the Sindh province to push against the construction of the Kalabagh Dam, which is a dam that would probably give more water to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab, but probably, according to the Sindhi perspective, deprive their province of water. So you see sort of a sustained new narrative about the Kalabagh Dam coming up in the Sindhi language media, which is very different from the one that's happening in the national media. And amongst the focus group discussions, there was this sense that The regional language channels hear us, they know our problems even better than the national media. They know what really concerns us. It's not just politics, it's more about our local everyday concerns. And they had a sense that the media was helping them approach their own political representatives in a more meaningful way. So that, members of the provincial assembly and other district commissioners and things were watching these channels and actually responding quite effectively. But the other thing was this feeling that there is finally some space for our voice in the national conversation. And as Pam described, when you had a state media, there was some one top-down version of events in the Urdu language, from broadcast from Islamabad, and now you have the ability to actually speak. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that this ability to speak is being used by groups that are aggressively pushed out of the national mainstream media narrative on a fairly consistent basis. So I've given you the example of the Sindhis being able to talk, have a different conversation about the Kalabagh Dam. The other thing that we've seen is amongst Saraiki speakers who live in northern Sindh and southern Punjab, the local media really pushed and generated momentum around call for a new province in southern Punjab for Saraiki speakers. And there is this sense amongst the Saraiki-speaking population that the momentum that has now built around the idea of granting, carving out a new province has come out of the fact that there was a new platform that people could start articulating this demand at. And there has been some sort of institutional progress towards thinking about how to make a new province in the area. But you also see this happening not just in regional language television channels and regional language newspapers, but of course on social media, which I'll touch on just briefly here. And what's happening is that social media is offering an opportunity for people who are being really pushed out of the sort of national conversation, certainly, but also this regional level conversation, people who don't have a way to participate at all in the public debate. They are turning to social media and finding a way to get their voice heard. And the best example of this, of course, is the Baloch separatists who are based in the western province of Balochistan, where there's been a low-level insurgency since 2006, and where the Pakistan army is accused of rampant human rights violations, of sort of trying to crush the separatist movement, and certainly keep the Baloch separatist voices and point of view out of the national narrative for decades now, not just the last few years. And Baloch separatists have become very savvy. They have blogs, they have Twitter feeds, and they do keep documenting human rights violations and other problems that they are facing on social media. And the way that this works is that it gets picked up by the international community. The international media sees that and starts writing about it. And in this strange, interesting loop of events then, the national Urdu language mainstream media that could never engage with these issues is now forced to confront them. And even if it doesn't directly cover them, it has to acknowledge that the international media just said something and that there is this Baloch point of view that has trickled out into the world. So you do see these kinds of significant changes happening, and the sense that we got from focus group discussants is that for the most part they think of this as really exciting and positive, and they finally feel as if they too are one of the actors in this historic institutional tussle that Pakistan has. That it's not just about top-level players like the army and the government, but also now the people who can speak to power. Now, of course, this is where it gets interesting. Not everything about the public's growing role in this national conversation is smooth or easy. For one of the main problems, of course, is that there is growing public disillusionment with state institutions. There's this sense that we are complaining. You can hear what our problems are. We do it fairly consistently on the airwaves, on Twitter. Why isn't anything being done about this? And so one of the things we also heard from our audience research was this growing sense of frustration and disillusionment, that there is no longer any secret about what the issues and challenges in Pakistan are. So why isn't there more responsiveness? And I do think that this lack of responsiveness or impact, which results, of course, from larger issues of governance, and we can talk about that later, that this could be seen to actually drive cycles of public grievance and actually fuel instability. So, for example, and this is just a banal example that happens in small, second-tier Pakistani cities every day, is enough media coverage of a power outage will eventually lead to a small power riot, right? So just on this mini scale, you're starting to see how this can be problematic. The other issue is the fact that Pakistan's sort of top-down narrative of social cohesion, religious cohesion that has long dominated Pakistan's public space is being challenged. There's suddenly this necessity of recognizing the ideological, ethnic, linguistic, religious heterogeneity that is Pakistani culture and the population at large, of course. And there is concerns now that this decentralized media, this Tower of Babel, as Pam put it, is actually going to fuel conflict. So the things that I talked about that we can frame in a positive light in terms of inclusion, democratic representation, etc., can also fuel fragmentation and sort of greater splintering. So Baloch separatists getting a larger voice is a threat to the Pakistani Federation in the opinion of many people. Similarly, increasing resentments between provinces as regional language channels highlight the different issues and sort of pit one province's problems against the other and make it a competitive conversation rather than a sort of safer conversation about Pakistani identity, Islam with a capital I, with no recognition of difference. That there is this threat, this increasing threat of fragmentation or splintering of some kind, and a lack of continued social cohesion. And of course, one of the other problems is that not all the voices entering this space are palatable to everyone. So you do see, and I'll give the most obvious example, which is the Pakistani Taliban are amongst the savviest media actors in the country. They have a presence in the mainstream media because they are interviewed, because they are able to intimidate or access journalists and ask them to give them space and a voice on the national platforms. They also have a lively online presence. Most of the religious extremist groups in Pakistan maintain Twitter accounts, blogs, Facebook pages, and there's increasingly a lot of space for this kind of divisive language and hate speech. And the most common example that is cited, but in some ways was the most telling, was the overall media response to the killing in 2010 of the former governor of the Punjab province, Salman Taseer, who was assassinated by his bodyguard for calling for changes to Pakistan's controversial blasphemy laws. And what you saw happening was that there was, at the exact same time, both on national channels, regional channels, online, supporters of Salman Taseer coming out calling for Pakistan to revisit the blasphemy law and sort of promote tolerance and things like that. And on the other side, you actually saw lots of people coming out in support of the assassin against Salman Taseer, and there was a lot of room for those kinds of views to be circulated. I'll just quickly start wrapping up here by saying that in addition to thinking about the sort of flip side of growing media access and inclusion, we should also be really careful at this point about naively assuming that everything that you hear in the Pakistani media or the public sphere is a genuine representation of the people's voice or a certain group's voice. We have to first ask whose voices are we hearing, and at this point I'll just put in a quick reminder that the Pakistani private media, and especially the broadcast media, remains a largely urban middle-class phenomenon. There are large parts of Pakistan that remain media dark, and this is primarily, of course, the western parts, Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The Pakistan state has not licensed private television channels to broadcast terrestrially. So these are all cable channels, and cable operators are then sort of curtailed from being able to develop the media infrastructure needed in some parts of the country. In some parts, because of the conflict situation, they aren't able to operate. But there may be sort of a larger design here as well in terms of controlling how much access the public actually has to this lively media space that I've been describing. The other thing, of course, is that the industry itself at all levels, perhaps with the exception at the moment of the social media space, is operating under multiple pressures, and Pam has outlined some of them. The one that I'll just reiterate again is it is one of the most difficult environments in the world, I think, for journalists to operate. The threats come from all sides. I think that's what makes it particularly challenging, is that it's not just the militants. And for those of you who follow this, you'll have seen that just this morning, the Pakistani Taliban have issued a hit list of journalists that they have now announced they will be trying to target in coming weeks. And they've sort of come out and put it in one of their memorandums saying that we consider the Pakistani media to be an actor in this conflict. They are confusing the public, and we now are going to take our fight to the media as well. So that's the sort of pressure that we think is the only one, but there is, of course, as Pam mentioned, pressure from the army, from political parties, from state intelligence agencies. And then, of course, there is that pressure, and in some ways, and it is the one that you feel most urgently when you do long interviews with media practitioners themselves, which is the financial model of the industry, the fact that this is ultimately a commercial game, that you are ultimately not serving the public, but the advertisers, that all the content you put out there has to get high ratings for this to be a sustainable phenomenon. And the end result of that is, as we do talk frequently, sensationalist media programming, appealing to the lowest common denominator, the lack of truly investigative journalism projects, even on non-controversial issues, etc. I'll just sort of wrap up at this point and say that you actually see Pakistan grappling with this issue quite in a fairly fraught manner. There is a realization that increased media access will lead to more inclusion, more democratic conversations, greater accountability, especially at that lower level, given that regional language channels and print publications are coming up at the exact same time that the Pakistan government has devolved power from the central government to the provincial levels. There's actually a really nice synergy there. But also, I think the greater concern now is about this concern about more hate speech, greater fragmentation, and platforms for divisive voices and threatening voices as opposed to productive one. And you can see that the Pakistan government is approaching this in a sort of fumbly confused and genuinely lost way, because we are simultaneously entering a really fascinating period in Pakistan's media evolution. On one side, the new government is going on with an auction of 3G spectrum, which is, I think, scheduled for March this year or April, I can't remember. But this would, of course, enable those 70% of Pakistanis who have mobile phones to now come online and actually participate in the online debate, get access to more information than ever before, to continue to watch television broadcasts even when they don't have electricity and the television is off, and also to start accessing media from other parts of the country, to sort of rise above the constraints of the cable medium and to actually have unprecedented access to this media space that I've been describing. At the same time, the government is also building an internet filtering system, and it is looking to use new technologies such as NetSweeper to filter internet content, to block websites, to control the space, to somehow come back to that old-fashioned system of having top-down control over what information is circulating. And this is all happening in parallel. It's the same government moving ahead with both policies, and I think that's a really good indication of how these questions remain, and they're really urgent, both at a policy level, but obviously in terms of people's ability to participate with a system that's changing. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to debating some of this in the conversation afterwards.
So let's move to Michael in a minute, but I just wanted to just say one thing that Huma reminded me of, and that is when Salman Taseer was killed, it was an incredible moment, I think, for the country. Everybody was just holding their breath. And you had two possibilities. One, leadership would come out using the newly free media and come out strongly and say, this is wrong, this has to be fixed, we can't allow this, we can't, give in to this sort of thing, which did not happen. No leader in the country stood up and said, this is murder, this is wrong, the blasphemy law needs reform, murder is wrong. Instead, what happened was the same media was allowed to generate and to echo and to promote this extraordinary outpouring from what we hoped is a minority viewpoint that championed the murder of a government official in the name of religion. And thousands and thousands of people poured into the streets. I was in Karachi when there was this, it was a few weeks later or a week later, there was thousands and thousands of people in the streets of Karachi marching in support of the assassination of the governor of Punjab. It was allowed to happen, it was promoted in the media, and it dominated the news. So again, you have opportunities that are being lost, and you have misuse that's being allowed. And that's why this is such a complicated topic. You know, what's the wheat and what's the chaff, and how do you manage it? So that's a question maybe we can talk about later. Michael?
So there's a couple of things I want to pick up on. I might mention to talk a little bit about Salman Taseer, the assassination, in a few moments. But there's one recommendation that certainly jumped out to us here at USIP from the report from BBC Media Action and Kim Yusuf and Imre Shoemaker was the suggestion that in designing media interventions, in coming up with media development policy for Pakistan, that there should be far more research, and in particular a far greater amount of content analysis, an attempt to understand what is actually happening in the Pakistan media as opposed to what we all constantly talk about, what might be happening in the Pakistan media. And I think this is something that applies not just to Pakistan. And I've just come from another meeting this morning where the BBC was releasing another report looking at the role for media in fragile states generally. I think one of the things that we agreed on there is that far more detailed research about what's happening in these countries is essential. There are people like me who are passing guests in these countries who go to Pakistan and read English language media, who don't speak Urdu, but who in some sense are involved in this debate or are involved in helping to design programs, to do research, to deliver training at different places in Pakistan, without necessarily an understanding of what's happening in, for example, the Urdu language media. The project that this research came out of was originally a project under the rubric of countering violent extremism, and we moved away from that for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. But one of the very interesting things for us in this research was that very quickly we became part of the story. We got our own sort of first-hand experience of the sensationalism of the Pakistan media. We had been going around the different media organisations and introducing ourselves and saying that we wanted to talk about the reporting of violence, in particular political violence in Pakistan. And I think 2 days into this event, myself and my colleague Theo Dolan, who's in the audience, were featured as the two Gora handing out $50 million to Pakistan media organisations. And of course we hadn't been contacted. No one had, we certainly didn't have $50 million to hand out to Pakistan media organisations to carry any favour. So we certainly hadn't been contacted about the story, yet here on one of the evening talk shows was this sort of expose of what these two people were doing in Pakistan. So we had our first-hand experience with sensationalism, and other people involved in the media debate in Pakistan have as well. So some of you may have seen the US Embassy cable that came out with the WikiLeaks leaks, where the US Embassy was basically saying, you know, we've had it up to here. We can't trust the Pakistan media. I think in particular that they were upset about GOTV and what they saw as incitement to violence and anti-Americanism. And the cable was essentially requesting that the BBG stop its broadcast arrangement with GOTV. And of course GOTV has their side of the story, and they rejected those claims quite dramatically. But when that came out and from WikiLeaks, it was a couple of years after I'd been working in Pakistan, or doing some work in Pakistan for the media development organisation Internews, and we'd been trying to convince the Pakistan embassy that they really should have a broad-based national media development program in Pakistan, and we were just getting this real stonewalling. There was just really very little interest in doing this in Pakistan, whereas across the board in Afghanistan there was this very large national broad-based media development project, and we found it very hard to understand. And of course, 2 or 3 years later, it became quite easy to understand when we realised that inside of the embassy itself there's this sense that the Pakistan media is out of control, and it's very difficult to engage. So in framing some of the data that I wanted to throw out today, I think one of the things that we've tried to do with this research is to work out what is the most constructive and effective way to engage with Pakistan media organisations themselves to address any media development needs that they have. And this is something, as Sheldon mentioned at the very beginning, was something that we feel that it's very important that the local media come up with a lot of the ideas about what happens in Pakistan going forward with media development. That it's very easy for media development organisations to sit in Washington and say, okay, well, we'll do training workshops and we'll set up radio stations and we'll do the kinds of things that we do pretty much everywhere that we go. But as we move through some of the examples, I think there are hopefully there'll be places that will see that the characteristics of the programming, the kinds of choices that people are making in the way that they report certain incidents, seem not to be the result of people not knowing that they should use more than one source, not knowing that they should provide context. Now, the Pakistan media has been growing, and there are many new journalists, but then there are also many people who are very, very good at what they do, and who know exactly what should be happening. And so it's maybe not a situation where people need to go in and teach people about sourcing. It's more a situation about where we sort of need to get a much better understanding about what is the calculus that's going on in different media organisations and in different newsrooms that lead people to make the decisions that they do, and to get them to rethink that calculus, because that's what's going to change things, not necessarily another round of 3-day training workshops. And as Sheldon mentioned, it's also really important for us when we're thinking about the kinds of interventions, the kinds of programs that we're capable of providing, the kind of support that we're providing, that we respond to what the Pakistan media itself thinks will be useful, that we start to come up with creative and non-standard ways to try to maybe shift some of the pressures and incentives, to shift the calculus to the extent that we can. So the project that we've embarked on was originally one in the rubric of countering violent extremism. Very quickly we came up against the problem of, well, what is extremism in Pakistan? Because there's what people in Washington think is extremism, or what people in Pakistan think is extremism. Very quickly it became clear that these were not necessarily the same things. And so, for example, with the murder of assassination of Salman Taseer, you saw a lot of media reports in the Western media that described that as extremism, and pretty much cast it in exactly the same light as all kinds of violence perpetrated by different sectarian groups, by the TTP and so forth. And I think one of the Moeed Yusuf, when we embarked on this process, one of the things that he was very, very clear to brief us on was that there's a kind of and this is something that we heard from people in Pakistan in our first trip as well, is that there's a certain mindset that maybe leads people to go out onto the streets and to support an assassination like that leads the media to report on it in the way that it does. It doesn't mean that the people who necessarily supported the assassination of Salman Taseer are people that support the TTP. And in fact, there's probably a very clear distinction between those groups of people. And so, what exactly are we talking about with extremism in Pakistan? And so, we sort of shifted the basis of our research to focus on the question of normalisation of violence. To what extent does the way that the Pakistan media report on violence lead people to believe that violence is an acceptable way to achieve social and political change? Or to what extent does it change the public standing or the acceptability of groups within Pakistan society who use violence as a means to try to achieve social and political change? And in particular, we focused on vernacular language media. So we weren't looking at the English language media. We were looking at, in fact, a combination of Urdu, Saraiki and Pashto language media organisations. Before we get into a little bit of the data, I mean, one of the last things I just wanted to say, as by way of introduction, is that a lot of the the assessments that different organisations do when they go in to do media development work in different countries are based on interviews. We ask people, whether it's people in the media or through focus groups, so what do you think's going on here, and we draw a variety of conclusions from that. And one of the things that came out of the data to some extent was that what people say they do, what people think they do, is not actually necessarily what they do. And so content analysis, alongside detailed interviews with people from media organisations and alongside audience research, is really important in ground truthing what is actually happening. Content analysis itself only tells you what the media is doing, of course. It doesn't necessarily tell you why journalists and different media organisations did different things. And it doesn't necessarily tell you what impact will that have on the audience members who consume that media. But it's an essential part of, it probably should be an essential part of assessments, and not just at the beginning of projects, but as these projects go forward. I've done probably more work in Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last 10 years, and I'm not aware of a single detailed content analysis study that's been done in Afghanistan since 2001. Masses of money has been invested in Afghanistan's media, yet I'm not aware of a single content analysis. I mean, there's been a little bit of media monitoring, people are reporting on this and that, but in terms of detailed content analysis of what local media organisations are doing, what national media organisations are doing, and not having that evidence base makes it really, really difficult to adjust what we're doing as we go. So, one of the let's start moving into some data. One of the things. Here we go. Unfortunately, people on this side of the room can't see the slides, so I'll just see. Okay. So this is one of the things that we were told as soon as we sort of landed in Pakistan, and this is actually a statement from a Pakistan non-government organisation that focuses on peace. And just in case there are people who can't read it, I'll say, it says the media is inadvertently glorifying the militants through a section of the mainstream Pakistan media, also though a section of the Pakistan media strives to be neutral or impartial, it generally is not. Consciously or unconsciously, it favours and glorifies radical groups, individuals and activities. An element of sympathy for radicals exists in the media. And we were told this by people, we were told this by newsroom managers in Pakistan, from some of the biggest media organisations, that their newsrooms were being infiltrated. Is that sure? It's okay. Were being infiltrated by people from militant organisations or with militant sympathies. And if, as I said, if we'd been doing a report based on interviews, I'm sure that this is something that we probably would have highlighted. That this is something that's coming from the heads of newsrooms. It's coming from different NGOs and civil society organisations. It's sort of dovetailed with other things that we were told by the managers of newsrooms themselves. One told us that, because this was around the same time that the floods were happening in Pakistan, and we were told that if you went out into my newsroom and told the journalists here that American bombers cloud seeding in Pakistan had caused the floods, half of them would accept that, and would want to do stories about it. So, what did we actually find? Well, what we found was that looking at, I should say, so I'll go back one step. There's one thing I skipped over, which is the content analysis period itself was from October the 8th to December the 8th, 2012. 2 months of collecting radio, television and print from Urdu, Pashto and Saraiki outlets. We did different series of content analysis to identify the stories that were about political violence, to identify the characteristics of those stories. For example, to what extent aggressors were identified, to what extent victims were identified, when people talked about victims and when people reported about victims and when they reported about aggressors, to what extent were they talked about in positive terms or negative terms, to what extent were sources used, who were those sources, and so forth. So overall, when we took a look at the entire sample, what we found was that the only aggressors to receive, on balance, any implicit endorsement of the use of violence were the police, military, or paramilitary forces, which were grouped together in our analysis as security forces. There was very, very clearly only stories that cast the use of violence in a positive light were regarded stories where that violence was coming from the state and not from non-state actors. In fact, in 204 cases where the security forces attacked one or more unnamed individuals, 26 of those reports, that's about 13%, demonstrated a positive slant toward the security forces. The vast majority were neutral, and only 1% negative. Overall, about an 11.76% positivity rating, if you like, for security forces using violence against unnamed individuals. When there were 39 cases where banned organisations attacked unnamed individuals, they received no positive reports at all. About half of the reports were neutral, and about half of the reports were negative. So when the security forces used violence, it was positive to neutral. When banned organisations used violence, it was neutral / negative reporting. So, if it were the case that the Pakistan media was being infiltrated by people with certain sentiments, such as this quote suggests, I think we might expect to see somewhat more sympathetic reporting. In fact, the sympathetic reporting that a quote like that suggests doesn't seem to be taking place. We were also really interested to understand how the Pakistan media was using framing to suggest things about the legitimacy of different actors using violence. Within academic media circles, framing research is probably the most common form of research, and there are certain sort of very conscious choices that journalists make to cover stories, and who to cover in those stories. But the idea of framing is that there's also a certain sort of unconscious, subconscious kinds of ways that we think about certain stories, and that bias just the general way that we approach those stories. And so we took a look at a whole series of different frames that we thought might be apparent in Pakistan media reporting of violence. To what extent was violence characterised through a whole variety of terms and an emphasis as terrorism? To what extent was it seen was it framed as a criminal problem? To what extent were aggressors or victims considered to be righteous? To what extent were aggressors or victims considered to be brave? And those kinds of framing elements. One of the interesting things that we found was that there was very little framing in the Pakistan media at all. I think that out of 8,000 segments, or out of 12,000 newspaper articles and 8,000 segments of television, I think only 2,000 of those, so it was 2,000 out of 20,000 segments, indicated that there was any use of framing at all. And where there was framing, it was the kind of framing that again sort of reinforced the idea that the government were the legitimate users of force, and that the banned organisations and non-state actors were the terrorists. That where there was righteousness, it was certainly not the banned organisations that were being cast in those kinds of terms. One of the things we were surprised, though, was that there was so little framing. That the reporting itself was just incredibly bland. We also looked to see to what extent there are master narratives that were apparent in the Pakistan media. If you're familiar with some of the countering violent extremism literature, there's an awful lot of talk about the narratives that extremist groups use, and one of the things that people are constantly encouraged to do in countering violent extremisms is to counter the narratives. And one of the things we were interested in was, well, if Pakistan media is being infiltrated by people from these organisations, are we seeing evidence of the kinds of narratives that militant organisations use themselves in Pakistan media reporting? in fact, are we seeing other kinds of narratives? Because there are narratives of the liberals in Pakistan. There are conservative narratives of the military. So we came up with a list. We came up with a series of narratives, or what we consider to be master narratives. And just to give you an example of what a master narrative might be, in the United States, something like the American dream. And you say the American dream, and instantly people know what you're talking about. It's a master narrative that easily carries other stories and helps people to immediately identify what you're talking about. And so we went through, and I think, Emma, you were actually involved in this process of identifying, well, what are the kinds of master narratives that are apparent in media produced by extremist groups, by the state, by the military, by liberals, and to what extent do we see these kinds of master narratives coming up in the news reporting or the opinion reporting that's going on in the Pakistani media? The brackets you're seeing after those narratives are the number of times that we found those narratives coming up in the Pakistan media reporting. So again, what we're seeing is if anything a great deal of blandness. So we weren't seeing a lot of evidence that the Pakistan media was being infiltrated. One of the things that we did then we sort of moved on to look at was, well, to what extent are organisations like the TTP able to influence Pakistan's media by threatening it? And we've heard already today that the threats against the Pakistan media made today. There's been at least two fatwas issued over the last 18 months, and many attacks against journalists. And journalists in Pakistan face a really sort of complex sort of dancing sort of routine that they have to go through to both satisfy pressures put on them from the military to report on political violence in a particular way, and from the militant groups themselves to report on political violence in very different ways. Obviously, the military would like to see it, in some sense, downplayed and reported negatively when it is reported, and the militant groups would like to see it reported and would like to see themselves reported positively. And one of the things that we found was that there was interesting proximity effect when you look at reporting of political violence in Pakistan. So one of the case studies that happened while in the content analysis period that we were looking at was the shooting of Malala Yousafzai. And so one of the things that we looked at was what is with regard to the aggressors and the victim, how are they treated by the Pakistan media, and how does that vary according to different media organisations and where they're based. So we're sort of taken off the names of the media organisations for this presentation, but if the blue bars here, which are showing sort of how positive the treatment of Malala Yousafzai was in stories in which the TTP was named as an aggressor, and where it's more positive is media organisations that are based outside of KP and Fatah. The orange bars, where when they mention the TTP, the positive treatment of Malala Yousafzai also sinks dramatically, also starts sinking. I went too far. Sorry. We're going to be taking a look at the negative treatment of aggressors. Overall, the treatment of the TTP in this case was overwhelmingly negative. However, when the TTP was, some stories mention the TTP as aggressor and some of them don't. When the stories mention the TTP as aggressor for media organisations based outside of KP and Fatah, the stories were much more negative than stories that just mentioned the fact that there had been an incident. In the same way, media organisations based in KP and Fatah, when they mentioned the TTP in a story, the extent to which those stories were negative then became less negative. I'm going to really quickly run through a few other bits of the research so we can sort of leave some time for questions. The slide is showing the extent to which when media organisations provide, in terms of the sources that they use, what kind of information do they provide about those sources? So the TV and newspaper organisations provide a great deal of basic information. But in terms of other kinds of contextual information that might help people make sense of what's happening in Pakistan in these political violence incidents, information about the history of those organisations, for example, there's almost no contextual information provided along with those organisations and individuals. In terms of the sourcing of the stories, you take a look at this again. This is across the whole sample of political violence stories for 2 months. Television organisations use no sources in 30% of the stories, one source in more than half, and only dual source stories in about 12% of the time. Newspapers, in some sense, even worse. There were no sources at all for more than half of the stories. Almost 40% of stories only had one source, and 2 sources were used very, very rarely. And this sort of goes back to one of the things I said at the beginning, that the idea of using more than one source is not difficult. It's not controversial. You probably shouldn't need a training exercise to help people understand that. So there must be some other reason why this sourcing isn't going on. I'm going to leave it there, so we're going to have some time for questions. But I think it's this kind of detailed content analysis that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, but actually helps us to understand really what's going on in the Pakistani media in terms of how much contextual information is being provided to help people understand these political violence incidents. To what extent aren't people being told who are the aggressors, and those kinds of questions.
Thank you very much. We've got just about half an hour left, and great food for thought. I was jotting some notes, and I'll just make a couple of, not comments, but maybe raise some questions that we might discuss. And before I do that, I'd like to know, is there anybody here from the Pakistani media? Yes? 2, good. Please, I would love to hear your comments about our presentation, and any ideas that you have would very much benefit from your input. Just a couple of things that occurred to me while I was listening. There's a war of labels going on here, a war of framing. One man's brave martyr is another man's subversive delinquent, forever and ever. And the question is, do you let that go, or do you try to control it? Let's look at the Battle of Shaheeds. TTP calls its dead Shaheed. Pak Army calls its dead Shaheed. What do you do about that? How do you even begin? What do? You go on television and say, no, there's only one side deserves to be called a martyr for Islam. Very difficult questions to answer in an Islamic state, essentially. Very, very difficult. And, I again, to go back to a point I made a little bit earlier, the media is only as good as the leadership of a country. When you have a weak state, when you have a weak civilian leadership, you're not going to have a strong democratic media. And that's, again, lost opportunities. So many times opportunities arise for leadership to assert itself, and it doesn't happen. This allows the airwaves to be dominated by people like, I don't know, Hamid Gul and Fazl Rahman, and they just grab people who have loud, strong opinions. And that, again, how do you control that? Do you train? Do you encourage? Do you reward? Do you punish? Do you support media that are being responsible and progressive? Do you somehow punish those who are not? These are very important questions, I think, for a country like Pakistan to look at. We didn't say much about the positive role of the media, and I want to mention a couple of things that we could talk about as well. Accountability. Accountability, both government, financial, and abuses. When I was researching my most recent book, I found that in most of the cases in which the abuse of women came to light, it was because of media exposure. In other words, when media went into a little village or a little town where police were not lodging an FIR against someone who had gang raped it only started happening once media pressure, Pakistani media pressure started. So that's number one, a very good thing. Number two, financial accountability. There's been some great scandals in the Pakistani media in the past few years, which never would have happened before. Again, there are always limits, there are always sacred cows. You can only go so far against certain people and certain groups, but it's much better than it was. Third thing, let's look at public service. I happened to be in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago when there was publicity about the fatwa issued by Maulana Samiul Haq supporting the anti-polio vaccine campaign. And it seems to be making a huge difference. I talked to a number of doctors and health professionals who told me at the time that we've been giving this message forever and ever and ever, but one announcement on television by a respected conservative Sunni cleric is far more powerful than anything we could do as doctors. So I just thought that was an interesting, you know, when these messages are going out for good, they're as powerful as when they go out for bad. So then the question is, how do you choose? How do you control? How do you weigh? How do you begin to handle all of this? And then, you know, there was something, the BBC report, maybe Huma could talk about this a little bit. What I liked in the BBC report was they talked about the role of the media as gatekeeper, agenda setter, and watchdog. We didn't really talk about that, but I just thought maybe if she'd like to say a couple of things about that so we get a better sense of what that means, and maybe a little scorecard on all three, briefly on the role. And then finally, I want to offer this comment, and based on Michael's comments about what is extremism and what is not. I guess I'd put it this way. The fulcrum of belief in Sunni, or let's just say in Muslim Pakistan, is not where we might wish it to be as Westerners. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. Being anti-Western in Pakistan is not the same as being pro-Taliban, and that's extremely important for us to understand. They may not like us, they may hate us, but they may also hate the Taliban. And I think it's really important that leadership in Pakistan, both government, private, media, continue to make that point. We have to accept that. We have to accept the fact that we are not popular. We, the West, are not popular among ordinary Pakistanis. But neither is the Taliban. And I think that's a very important message for people to be sending out of the media in Pakistan. Anyway, so I want to open up for questions, and if either of the gentlemen from Pakistani media would like to say anything, I'd be delighted. Sir.
Yeah, my name is Amanullah Presa. I've been covering Pakistan locally and internationally as well. I agree with whatever was said here, but there's one thing probably was missing. I have my own opinion. I don't know if you can agree with me or not. When it comes to glorifying the terrorists, sometimes actually the political party competitions, actually inadvertently, there are journalists like in Pakistan. The journalists are affiliated with the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz Sharif group. The journalists are affiliated with the People's Party. Okay, now, when the governor who belonged to the Pakistan People's Party, when he was murdered, it was a very good chance for his political opponents to show the Pakistan People's Party wrong or bad so they can get more votes in the next election. That was the main purpose behind, like indirectly glorifying the terrorists. So what happened? So they had their own journalists. I'm not mentioning the name, let's say Pakistan Muslim League, they had their own journalists. So they thought probably it's a good chance now to condemn the governor because to make him look bad. And again, similarly, when it comes to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, the Pashtun nationalists stanched against the Taliban all the time. Okay, now they lost the election, they lost popularity for many reasons. Okay, now Imran Khan, for example, he's a political leader. Now he's the leader of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the main biggest leader. Now he has a reputation to be very soft on Taliban. So there are some journalists who before were supporters of the ANP, the Nationalist Party. They were very strong against Taliban. Now they're keeping quiet because the leader is keeping quiet. This is one very big challenging area. I think probably it's better if somebody communicates with the journalists there and try to find a way to cut them off from the political party and to let them know the national interests of the country as a whole. That's the biggest problem, I think.
So how would you go about that? I mean, again, we're in a country where we're talking about media is owned, and media very often in Pakistan reflects the views of the owner or the group that's owning it. How do you make an independent media?
I think it's very difficult. Actually, Pakistan had this independent media all of a sudden, like you mentioned, actually. There are many problems. Probably illiteracy is a very big problem. Visionarism is a very big problem as well, like when it comes to color bargaining. Okay. Pashtuns and Sindhis are totally against, all the Pashtun and Sindhi journalists are against as well. But if you go to Punjab, for instance, you can find many journalists, they're supporting it. So we have this problem. It's a very complex problem. Probably, I think one way could be that the owner of all these big TV channels, if they are approached and they are responsible to a large extent about the policy of their channels, and they have their own different interests, again, political parties, revenues, blah, blah, blah. So if they know that actually when it comes to the single national interest of the country, or let's say legitimacy of something, how the journalist should work in that TV channel. For example, take an example of Geo TV, which I know very well. It's like for the last many years, it's very pro-Nawaz Sharif. So whatever they would say, it would be in favor of Nawaz Sharif. Even they criticize him, they criticize the way they favor him. So this is a big problem. I don't know, I personally don't know how this problem can be fixed, but it's up for discussion to find a way how to deal with it.
Thank you. Sir, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, my name is Shahid Nadeem. I've been associated with Pakistan television for a long time. So I'm an insider and an outsider also, because I've been involved with the socially meaningful theatre group. And we have been fighting extremism and forces of authoritarianism. I think that like in previous years, Pakistan television or the government had the monopoly, and so they were the major force determining the agenda for television. Then army was another force, so it was a sacred cow, and when it came to national issues or foreign policy matters, then we couldn't touch army, so media had to be very careful about that. Then came the media owners, and they, especially with the cross-media ownership, they became too powerful and totally unaccountable. I mean, there is no force monitoring them, government or their own peers, and so they are just running amok, and they are just sold to the god of ratings, and they will do anything to get ratings. So national interest or interest of the people, that is not really the first thing in their mind. And now another force has appeared, and this is the invisible enemy, Taliban and their supporters. So now I have noticed recently, like in the last few months, that the way our journalists refer to Taliban or the dead Taliban or living Taliban, there is now a sense of respect and balance, as if they are also respectable. I mean, we have different words for someone who is killed for criminal activity and people who are martyrs. So now they kind of balance it out and refer with great admiration or at least respect or fear when they are referring to Taliban. And so whenever they are reporting, it's not just the political leadership who are showing opportunism, but our media owners as well as the anchors or reporters who are either fearful or they lack commitment. And this has permeated to the entertainment sector. So now our dramas, for example, or music, you see a lot of religious people, a lot of bearded heroes who are actually saying their prayers as well as sort of being the protagonist in the play. And in all talk shows, even entertainment-oriented talk shows, wherever there is a problem, the solution lies with a mullah coming and giving an advice. So media has actually added to our problems by catering for this kind of rating-driven agenda, and also opportunism when we find that it is much easier to exploit religion or exploit the so-called ideology of Pakistan and get more ratings. So it's much wider problem, and I think the main thing is for the media owners to be controlled and reined and to be held accountable either by government or by their own consumers, because if that doesn't happen, then I think the pressure and a very clever manipulation of media by Taliban, the way they issue threats and the way they have sympathizers within the media, I think they are going to then have the upper hand. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's open it up for general questions from the audience for our speakers. Sir.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. First, I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhary with Pakistan American League. We mentioned about the image of Pakistan. It is understandable. The image of Pakistan will become better only if the people of Pakistan are given constitutional protection and our democratic values and human rights are respected. And Pam said the right thing, media has got the power, but does not exercise the responsibility that power brings along with it. And the society is complex and difficult. Because of absence of rule of law, the diversity has become weakness of that country. But in USA, the diversity has become the strength of the nation because of presence of rule of law. This is the big difference here. And now I'll come to words Huma. It's a beautiful name, beautiful bird, and a very rare bird. Anyway, you had shown many silver linings about Pakistan. And as an analyst, I still continue to remain concerned because even the nuclear clouds have a silver lining. My question is related to two-pronged question. One is that since the country is run by individuals and not through institutions, so it is generally a perception that there the in-laws and outlaws are more powerful than the laws. So the rich people have bought or started their television channels to use them not only to protect their wealth, some of them use it as a leverage. And the jungle, 90 television channels in Pakistan, the jungle is too small for so many lions. Do you think this perception, how far is there truth to it, that most of the channels, the people are bought and sold, and many times to achieve their objectives? Because since the country is governed by individuals, they use their television channel as a leverage. And second part is this area out of bound for the media to educate people by questioning the ruling elite, the leadership, about their policies, about their decisions, about their promises, about their integrity, about their character, about their commitment towards their own people and the country? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll take the second part of your question first. I think the only thing that the media does, and by media now I'm talking about news and current affairs television shows in different languages, as well as talk shows on private radio and journalists on Twitter, so the whole lot of it, I feel all they do is question the government about its policies and things. I think what becomes, there is so much political bashing in the Pakistani media. It is the mainstay of their content and programming. And one of the main reasons for that is because there isn't that many other things that they can bash. That's one thing, right? You can't talk about religious issues, you can't talk about the army, so that leaves the civilian government sort of up for grabs in some ways. But I think the real question is why doesn't this 24/7 on multiple up to 25 news and current affairs channels, constant critique of government officials, constant exposés of their failures in governance at the local level? It's down to things like, why didn't this road get built? At the national level, it is big and increasingly more complex discussions about the counterterrorism strategy, relations with the US, etc. Why isn't this making a difference? I think that is the real question. And I think that gets to a point which is broader than the media itself, and we start getting into all these issues about Pakistani politics, the nature of it, how truly democratic is the setup in a political patronage setup, are our leaders truly elected, are they truly accountable? Those are difficult questions to answer, and something topic for another panel perhaps. But from the media's point of view, they actually feel that they are playing just this one role, which is to try and hold the powers to account. What they rely on, because of a lack of resources to do proper investigative work, And because of the commercial model of the industry, which requires them to continue to do new high ratings-oriented programming. So there's no space in this for a long 3-month investigative project that looks at some financial misappropriation in some low-level contract given to the Hyderabad electric supply company. No journalist is given the time or the space or the resources to do that. They have to chase that sensationalist story. This politician said this remark, and we can make a joke about it, or we can sort of put pressure on them today, but now tomorrow is a new day, and another politician has said something else. So there's no sustained coverage of political issues as systemic issues. I think that's one of the problems, and that very much is directly linked to the nature of the commercial and financial pressures on the industry to get those high ratings and keep things going. So it's not a very sophisticated conversation. To sort of talk more broadly about, you made this point about individuals, and I think the media industry offers a really interesting counterpoint, because for the largest and most influential channels are all owned privately by families that have long associations with the media. And if you talk to the top level management, the owners, the high level news directors, senior journalists, news anchors, right now there is deep, deep introspection amongst the industry. They really are battling this problem. How do we juggle these pressures on us? How do we juggle the fact that our reporters are getting threats from the army, from the Taliban, from the local Politico, and the only thing that we're asking of them is to make us some money by doing a really cracking, fun news report that we can run at 9 p.m. There's so much deep introspection about issues like how to cover sectarian violence. Do you identify that act of violence as a sectarian clash? Do you name the Sunnis and Shias or whoever else is involved? Or do you, but a lot of them don't do it for fear of perpetuating further cycles of violence. Because if you say that, 4 Shia men were killed, that means tomorrow 4 Sunni men will be killed as well. So then they try not to identify, but then they come under fire for supporting certain groups or sects or things like that. So the individuals are in fact in this way finding themselves increasingly powerless in the face of these broader pressures that they're facing. And the way that they're trying to counter that goes back to the point Pam made about public service, is that you're starting to see these campaigns within, especially broadcast media, TV and radio, where CEOs take it upon themselves to use some of the advertising revenue that they get to internally finance public service campaigns that deal with things like health, dengue fever, polio. There's a big campaign going on right now, the Zara Sochiye one that the Jung Group is doing, which is to promote education in the country. They've previously done really effective campaigns against violence against women. So they are trying to atone for the other sins that they feel that they're forced to do by doing this public service programming. So in some ways, I feel the individuals are the best position to try and save the problem. I'll just say a quick note on politicization, which has come up in many of the comments that came. And I think, again, we have to connect this to this financial model of the industry that we're talking about. To remain financially viable, these channels need to get money from somewhere. And politicians are increasingly realizing that you cannot function in the Pakistani political space or the public space without having the mouthpiece that these channels offer. And so the first thing they do is go to cash-strapped channels and behind the scenes give all sorts of money in order to get that kind of access that many of you have described. So how do you tackle that problem? Some of it is just, the people who are in charge of being watchdogs need to be watched as well. We do need greater transparency amongst media groups. They need to do financial reporting. There has to be, there's nothing wrong with a channel having a political inclination, but that's where questions come up that Michael was touching on, which is, what can we do to promote media literacy amongst audiences? How do we give them the opportunity just to be able to recognize, this channel is always PMLN friendly. There must be something going on, a close relationship, a political standpoint that the ownership has. Fine, I get it. So now I can be a bit more critical about their programming. So there's lots of work that can be done, and some of it is very doable. It is just, publish your annual report, and let's start talking to students in our, journalism programs and universities about being more critical about how they view media.
Steve?
Thanks. My name is Steve Hirsch. I am here as a senior U.S. editor for UPI Next, which is UPI's international mentoring program. I do want to say, with regard to what Huma just said, in this country, unless you work for the Washington Post or the New York Times, you probably don't have the time to do those long investigative pieces either. And you're thrown on a spectacular story, but that's a topic for another meeting. Pam mentioned media as watchdog, and so this gentleman over here. I just wanted to say that one effort in that vein is something that we do at UPI Next. In addition to mentoring young journalists, we have a governance accountability site called Truth Tracker, which is modeled on PolitiFact, which we use to write articles that trace Pakistani politicians' performance on their promises. And we have gotten some good ink in BBC in Urdu and BBC in English as well. It's not my part of UPI Next, so I'm sort of reading from a paper here. But we published about 130 articles. It's been very popular. And I think it's filling a need. I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's small at this point, but it's something that we've seen as well. So I'm there with you.
I was thinking that when you were both talking, and Michael, we were talking about sort of what can be done. There's a tendency for good, objective, articulate journalists like Huma to get, fellowships to go all over the world, and that's a good thing. But maybe an equally important use of international money from places like USIP and various media institutes would be to fund some long-term projects, to take, a newspaper or a team or an investigative team in one of the big newspapers or television and actually fund projects on some of these. I don't know if anything like that has been done. I don't think it has, but it seems to me that would be worth
I bet we'd be happy to work with you on it.
Did you want to say something about that?
Yes, my name is Faiz Rahman. Actually, I'm also from Pakistani, well, sort of. I'm with the Voice of America, and I had the service there, so we do broadcast to Pakistan. I have a question, and before I ask that question, I just give you a little example. Actually, I briefly served as a senior news director at one of the top channels in Pakistan. Back then, there were only 2 channels, Geo and RY, and was one of them. So, and one of the debates and the very serious discussion that we were going through was whether we want to be like Fox or CNN. So, in your study, did you find that how much the Pakistani media is basically influenced by the Western media? And all these issues that, been raised by all of you, basically, reference back to the West, like whose hero is who is one's terrorist and who is one's martyr. We have had this discussion and in this society, in the West as a whole. Nelson Mandela is a big example. So, and having said that, and there's also one more very important point, that Pakistan is a very illiterate country. If you have a national media, you got to have stringers, correspondents in all across the country. And in some of those areas, people can't even read, but they become like overnight sensation by becoming an unpaid card-carrying correspondent. And then you basically rule the area there. You just become a hero. So you have to take that into account. And also the infancy of the media, because we just don't have the resources to recruit people with proper education. There's no concept of sourcing, at least using one source or two sources, and going through the whole process before it becomes an actual news item. So, but basically, just going back to my simple question is, what would you say? How much the West, the influence that the West has on Pakistani media? Thank you.
Well, the highest ranking show in Pakistan right now is Pakistani Idol. And we all know where that model came from. No, so, which is, of course, the sort of music contest show and things, That's a sort of facetious answer to the question, though. But I actually think that the industry, it may pick up sort of journalists who come on US-funded exchange programs, of which there are quite a few actually underway, and spend some time in newsrooms. They go back with story ideas. The online space is certainly looking to Western online newspapers to see what sort of content you can put out. But I don't think that content-wise they are looking to the West as much as perhaps they were earlier on to try and figure out how to position themselves. It is much more just the same way that you get inspiration. I heard this great thing on NPR which looked at food. Let me do a story on food in my city. To that extent, it happens everywhere. The real impact, and I think the significant impact that international media is having in Pakistan is when the Western press covers an issue that was not being covered within the national media for reasons of intimidation, censorship, whatever it was. But the minute the New York Times does the story, then everyone can talk about it. And you say, well, the New York Times did this story. And I think that has really opened up debate on many very controversial issues that otherwise would never have made it out there.
Maybe that's why they expelled Declan.
I'll leave that to Declan to discuss. And just very quickly, I'm really glad you brought up the point about the stringers. And we do talk a lot about this in the report. It's the boring stuff about talking about media in Pakistan. But up to 85% of the journalists working in Pakistan do so on a freelance basis. They get paid irregularly and really, really poorly. And as you say, there are perks to being a journalist. What happens? You set up shop, you become the journalist in your village, and then you take bribes, and then you do stories that fit with whoever paid the highest amount of money that someone was willing to pay you. And I think that, again, this is a simple correction that can be done. Professionalize the journalists' unions, professionalize the industry, make some sort of better arrangement, especially for the broadcast media, to pay its stringers more sustainably and consistently.
Yeah, I say, I mean, in some countries that USIP does research in, the kinds of issues that we come up against is the things that people are saying, which are the incitement to violence. So it'll be a word, cockroach, or something else that's used over and again that incites violence. And the interesting thing for us in Pakistan it's what's not being said, which is interesting. So that in all the political violence incidents we looked at, I think it's only across those, only in 26% of the cases was an aggressor ever actually identified. If you looked at a particular incident, for example, the attempted assassination of Qazi Hussain Abad, which also happened during that period, there were 49 stories that we looked at in our sample. In only one, possibly two of those stories, was there any suggestion made that the TTP might have actually been behind that? Which was pretty odd, because only about 5 months earlier, Qazi had said some particularly inflammatory things about the jihad in Pakistan not really being a jihad, as opposed to the jihad in Afghanistan being a jihad. And of course, the TTP weren't particularly happy about that and made some overt threats. Yet 5 months later, there's an assassination. It's using a woman's suicide bomber, a method that the TTP has used before. There's a variety of possibly circumstantial but contextual elements that make you think, well, it'd be really worth investigating this, but it didn't happen.
On the other hand, when Benazir was assassinated, it was immediately blamed on the TTP, which probably had nothing to do with it. Anyway, different world. Ma'am.
Yes, I'm with the State Department. I'm the Pakistan Public Diplomacy Desk Officer, and we do bring over at least 100 journalists a year on exchange programs, and we're setting up journalist training programs in Pakistan. Because one recurring theme that we do find is the professionalism of training. And I know you said, Michael, that you didn't think training was enough. So in addition to the exchange programs of fostering professional development within Pakistan, what are some other things, areas that you think as a State Department that we should be engaging on with journalism in Pakistan?
Sure, I mean, and that's not a simple question, and it's partly sort of why we're going to the Pakistan media organisations themselves to try to say, okay, well, these are the kinds of characteristics that we see in the reporting that you do of political violence. We can sort of identify which ones of those are actually training deficits and could actually be addressed through training, and which ones are happening because of other structural factors within the Pakistan media that are not going to be impacted by training. And then hopefully also to identify, as I said, some ways to change that calculus. And I think so one of the things that's been talked about a little bit is to what extent, for example, the advertising industry and the power that it holds could to what extent are there individuals within that industry that could provide incentives for particular kinds of programs or disincentives for other kinds of programs to be broadcast. And I think there was one instance a couple of years ago. I think there's an infamous program where I forget the name of the host, but there were an expose of people in parks and what they were. People holding hands.
Yeah, just on dates. Yeah.
On dates in parks, and some of the advertisers sort of made their voices felt. I mean, she lost that program got a program on another channel very quickly after that. But at least there was some kind of suggestion that there are people within the advertising industry in Pakistan who are part of let's face it, the liberal elite who may have particular interests that they're willing to put money behind. So, and it's probably not going to be one thing. It's probably going to be a whole series of little things like that. We'll have more on that in about 2 months' time.
We're almost out of time. Obviously, you'd like to say something.
Okay. Well, my name is Sher Zaman. In the recent part, I was involved with some of the media industries in Pakistan. So recently, I'm an international student on one of the exchange program by the US State Department. It's a collaboration between Pakistan and United States. So the things which the panel discussed, to somehow I would agree to some of the points. Like Pakistan is the most dangerous country for the journalist. We have read so many reports. We can agree. But on the lighter note, I would take this opportunity, and I'm glad. I feel comfortable. I feel glad that the international media has raised the issue of Malala. It's excellent. But in the recent part, I think I saw some of the stories about one of the lady, Samina Beg, who had recently climbed the Mount Everest. But right now, I will take this opportunity to let you know that right now, Samina Beg and Mirza Ali, brother and sister, are on an adventure diplomacy mission. So what they will do is to climb 7 countries' mountains, including Republic of Argentina, Republic of Indonesia, US, Pakistan, Nepal, Russia. So right now they are on a mission of 7 countries. So what I would
should definitely go with them.
So I would. So I want that international media would also raise that issue as well, because in the recent past, the women empowerment is on a very peak stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, but I very much want to thank our guests, Huma and Michael. Would you like to say a couple of words each before we go, or is this it?
You can go first.
Any one single final comment from either of you?
Look out for a longer report in about 2 months' time.
Okay.
And please feel free to pick up copies of the BBC Media Action Report outside.
Thank you all for coming, and hope we'll see you again soon.
What I hear people do at these events, and then I say, why did this person have to do this? You already know it. So I'm here to welcome you and thank you for being here. Sheldon has said much of what I wanted to. I am Moeed Yusuf. I head the South Asia program here at USIP. I just want to quickly run you through what we do and then hand it over to Pam to do what we're really here for. The South Asia program traditionally has been focused mostly on Pakistan. That's been our biggest program in the South Asia Center, and Afghanistan in the sort of Afghanistan and Central Asia part of our South and Central Asia division. In Pakistan, we do both research and analysis and also programmatic work with civil society through our own expertise in USIP and our grant-making program, which works with local partners and civil society on the ground to effect 2 things. One, to inform better policy making through our research and analysis and improve the credibility of the Pakistani state. And second, specifically to work on increasing tolerance of diversity in Pakistan. And these are the 2 areas that we see USIP have a niche in, but also the 2 drivers of conflict, which I think are often not understood well in Pakistan. So that's where most of our work is focused. Media is an essential component of that, and Sheldon and his team do a fantastic job. I wouldn't steal Michael's thunder, who will tell you about the research work that we've done over the past year. But in addition to research, we also work in the messaging space through the media, through social and electronic and print media, to try and reduce the space for violence, which is often generated through these messages, and media is a part of that, to increase the social taboo on violence and to increase the incentives for peaceful behavior. And so research and this messaging come together to make our media work potent in Pakistan. Finally, just quickly, Sheldon mentioned Huma has published reports for us in the past. Her report on Karachi, the conflict dynamics in Karachi, you'll find outside, and it's definitely a must read given what we hear about Karachi every day It really gets into the nuts and bolts of what is going on there. Her report is part of our broader project on conflict mapping of Pakistan. And what we do is we go to the
It is extremely positive for the society, opening up access to new voices in many languages. I noticed that I think in rural areas there's even higher coverage of social media and cell phones than there is even in urban areas. You know, you can now reach village elders on a cell phone. People are now tweeting from the most remote parts of Pakistan. So there's now this proliferation of communication that was never there before in a very short time, really a decade, and really even, it's really been for the past half decade that this really has begun to snowball with all the good and all the bad. Part of the problem is that, as with any newly developing media, especially in a country as complicated as Pakistan, where you have very strong military intelligence institutions and where you have a violent conflict going on, there's always a question of how far to go. How far can you go in a country like Pakistan? What can you criticize? What can't you criticize? Whom do you have to fear? Whom do you have to worry offending? And if we just take the most obvious one to begin with, the Army and its related agencies, it's very easy to criticize, but only up to a point. And I'll just use a wonderful quote here. In the latest melodrama about Musharraf and would he or wouldn't he be going on trial, there was lots of wonderful commentary about, would the military establishment allow him to go on trial? And there was this wonderful quote that I used in a story from this wonderful lawyer and columnist Babar Sattar, who said that basically the effort to prevent him from going on trial was as follows. This is about bravado, hubris, and impunity, touted as professional honor and esprit de corps. The safe exit option for Musharraf is not meant to guard against a general being punished, but to preempt the ghastly precedent and ignominy of a general being tried in civilian court. It's a lovely quote, very glib, very articulate, but it's only a comment. It's not about facts. When you start getting into facts, when you start delving into things that the military holds sacred, its perquisites, its property, its power, you can get in very serious trouble, as Salim Shahzad did, got killed for.
Okay, let's get started, shall we? Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here at USIP on this cold and gray day. Thank you all for making the trek to be here. Over in Karachi, on the other hand, where much of Pakistan's media is based, it is a positively balmy 77 degrees. And it was in Karachi just 1 week ago that yet another attack was made on journalists. 3 employees of the Express Media Group were gunned down and another injured. So Pakistan remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists, which is just one of the many pressures that shape Pakistan media reporting of conflict and politics. I'm Sheldon Himmelfarb, I manage our Peace Tech initiative here at USIP, where we work at this nexus of media, technology, and data in an effort to tackle the challenges of conflict management and peace building. And we are really honored to have a wonderful panel here who are going to take you inside many of the other pressures on Pakistan media. We're all familiar with that critique of sensationalism in the Pakistan media and the concerns that the race for ratings is one of the things fanning the flames of intolerance. But in each of the presentations today, I think we're going to get well beyond that simple or simplistic critique. And we are really happy to have our friends from BBC Media Action with us, and we're looking forward to diving into their latest insights into Pakistan. Their report focuses on regional vernacular media and on social media, which adds depth and complexity and should prompt new thinking about the media's potential for fostering inclusive dialogue and participation of diverse voices in Pakistan's political debates. And both of the authors, Huma Yusuf, who's here with us today, and Emma Shoemaker, they are all both friends of USIP who have worked with USIP on research papers and media assessment methodologies. So welcome back to USIP, Huma. Here at USIP, we are coming to the end of a detailed research project on Pakistan media reporting of violence, using a combination of audience research, media interviews, and extensive content analysis. We are ground truthing some of those claims that I referred to earlier that are made about the Pakistan media. And USIP is deeply committed to the idea that change must originate with local media organizations and citizens. So importantly, we're about to go to the Pakistan media organizations themselves with our research, to talk about this research and put them in the driver's seat about what should be done with this. But it's also intended to assist media policy and program design, and we need to be thinking about how our priorities and our methods should change to assist Pakistan media organizations to help them achieve their goals. And Michael Dwyer, who's on the panel here, has been leading this important work at USIP. It's a busy and exciting time for us here in what we call our Peace Tech Initiative. Earlier today, some of you were here. I noticed some of you were here this morning. We launched our media assessment of the media in Myanmar. And we've also this week published the third of our Logs and Bullets research on the role of social media in the Syrian conflict. So all of those reports are out there on the desk outside, and I would really urge you to take a look at them if you're interested in this nexus between media and conflict. I'm going to hand over the podium in a minute to Moe to say a few words, but I should also say it's a great pleasure to welcome Pam Constable back to USIP to moderate this discussion. Glad to see you here, Pam. To respond to the presentations and to generally challenge all of you to be a very active audience. Her 2 books on Pakistan are must-reads, so you can be sure that our panelists know that they're not going to be getting away with any loose talk today with Pam as our moderator. Speaking of loose talk, last thing, housekeeping, please set your phones on stun mode. Or we'll have to ask our friends in the NSA to do it for you. It's just a joke. So, welcome everyone. I'm really pleased that you're here. Let me turn it over to Moe to say some introductory words as well.
Thanks. Welcome everyone to USIP and to this event. My job is to do national level, whether it's provincial, ethnic, communal, geographic, etc., and look at various dynamics of conflict across themes, across geography in Pakistan. And there, media again fits in crucially, and the topic that Huma is going to talk about today, because we are now moving from an understanding of Pakistan at the national level, which we do all the time, looking at English media, English language press and media, to regional and sub-regional outlets of print and electronic media, which really, I think, influence Pakistan much more than the national level that we consume here in Washington and others. So I look forward to hearing this, and Pam, it's over to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me, more or less? It's a small room, so we should be okay. Delighted to have you all here. And especially happy to see Huma, who I got to know when we were both fellows at the Wilson Center. I was working on my most recent Pakistan book, and she was working on some of her projects, so we became good friends, and it's glad to see her here and to read this report, which is really excellent. Happy to meet Michael after some phone conversations, meet you in person. I'm just going to make a couple of brief points before turning it over to Huma and her report, and then hopefully afterwards we'll have a lively discussion. Feel free to make comments, critiques, as well as questions. We really would like to have a provocative and thoughtful exchange. When I was coming here today, I was thinking that the first time I worked in Pakistan, which was in 1998, there was basically almost no media at all. It basically consisted of Pakistan state television, which basically consisted of cricket matches and propaganda videos about atrocities in Kashmir. That's pretty much all you could see. So too little. Now, of course, we've gone the other extreme. Too much. Too many voices, too many competing channels. It's really become a Tower of Babel in some ways. But I think all of us would agree that's much better than the alternative. Yet, we also know that Pakistani media is very much a work in progress. It's both fledgling and deeply flawed. As Huma has said and pointed out in the report, it does much that